Hospital Porter's Pride and Dignity, Stop the New World Order. Welcome to Panwo TV and welcome to this, the second part of this three-part watch party. My watch party is always in three parts. The first bit is the introduction, which you'll have seen. The second part, of course, is the review, which I'm doing now. Third part is the live stream, which I'll be doing at some point in the future. Now, I must apologise, first of all, for doing the review so soon after the introduction. That's unusual for me. I usually leave it a couple of weeks to give you guys a chance to go and watch the film in whichever way you can and fit it into your schedule. The reason I haven't done it this time is because I'm basically going to be away for the next 5 days, or from Friday onwards. And I don't like to leave that big a gap in my schedule. So what I've done is I thought I'll do this review now, and you guys can choose whether or not to watch it now, depending on whether you've seen the film. If you haven't, just don't watch it, and you've got like all the time I've been away, all the time I'm going to be away, to go and watch the film we're talking about, and then you can come back and watch the review. But if I could have left the review till after I get back, but then I'll have the reportage I'm doing from my trips, and I'm doing two events. I'm doing a conference reportage and a live show in Mablethorpe, Lincolnshire, although I might make that an audio only and put it on a Panwo radio, I'm not sure. So that's what's happening coming up. So I thought, let's get this out of the way now while I still can, as the clock ticks down. The film I'm reviewing is, of course, Picnic at Hanging Rock, a 1975 film by Peter Weir. Starring just about everyone you've seen in the Australian soap operas, as I said last time. I recognise a lot of them. I recognise probably most of the cast, just by sight, because of course I've watched Australian soap operas. You can't actually avoid them, can you? I mean, they're everywhere. Home and away, neighbours. Everybody needs good neighbours. It's one of their big exports. Actually, is the soap operas. Indeed, the cast members I recognise. Many of them I know best from. Like I said, I'm not a big soap fan of any kind, and some soap operas I actively despise, like EastEnders or Tavistock Enders, as I call it. I did used to be a big fan of Prison Cell Block H, though. I thought that was a rare jewel in a dung heap. And ironically, that's the one that's panned the most by the critics, but I thought it was actually pretty good. I actually recognised many of the cast members from that. They've appeared in large or small roles, and of course they don't look that much older in Prisoner, because Prisoner actually started, I think, 1978, so it was only a couple of years after Picnic at Hanging Rock. So a lot of them you may recognise, but they look a lot older because they're in the soap operas of the 80s, 90s, or indeed this century up to the present day. And this film by Peter Weir, as I said in the introduction, I think is going to be of great interest to viewers here. It's a very well done movie, a well done mainstream mystery chiller with a distinct supernatural theme, which I think will appeal to viewers of this channel. Now, I've got to apologise. I normally do these sorts of videos in my studio area, which is like on a little seat to my right, just literally about 30 centimeters to my right. The reason I haven't done that this time is because basically I don't have a camcorder at the moment. I don't have one. I'm actually going to little experiment. I'm going to shoot the reportage coming up on my mobile phone just to see if it works. I think it will, because some of my trip to Wales was done on my mobile phone. So when I get a new camcorder, which I will eventually, I'll start filming again from my studio area. Now, I should point out, I said in the introduction, it's best to get the long version of the film. If it's a director's cut and it's longer, then watch that one. If it's a director's cut and it's shorter, don't watch that one. I think it was wrong, actually, because there is an extra scene at the end of the... there's an extra scene that's actually missing from the 1998 cut. That's really the only difference I could detect. And I've watched both versions now. I couldn't detect any other difference. The ending, literally, I think all Weir did was he cut off the final scene of the film, which actually may have been a good thing. I think it may have been a good thing. What happens at the end of the film is that I'll explain as I go along. Basically, the character Mrs. Appleford goes to Hanging Rock herself and that's when you get that. Then you get the outro explaining her body was found at the bottom of the rocks. No, at the bottom of the rocks. If they thought she fell trying to climb the rocks. There's no real. There's always a mystery about how she died, but you get the impression when she goes to these rocks that she's gonna basically she has the same experience as the girls who disappeared. And I think it's actually quite badly done. It's out of character for Mrs. Appleford. Every other scene she's in, every other scene you see her, she's in the school, and it's just kind of where she belongs. So I think that was out of character for Mrs. Appleford. Basically, this film is set in 1900 in Australia, in February of 1900, the middle of the Australian summer. It's literally less than a year to go till Federation. Federation, as I explained before, it was a major event in Australian history, because the most significant event actually, because it's when modern Australia was born. It's when the nation of Australia, as it is today, a Commonwealth nation, was created. It was created out of 6 self-governing colonies. That was basically Victoria, New South Wales, Western Australia, named basically after they've got the same names as the modern Australian states, and these came together to become the Federation of Australia. And this happened on January the 1st, 1901. Now you can see here that it was a major event which people celebrated, because this essentially was independence for them. This was essentially independent. This became the largest independent state to break away from the British Empire. And here's a little. You see, this is Sydney Town Hall on the night it happened. There you go. Let's party like it's 1901. Yeah, one people, one destiny, and there's the fireworks. So everyone was having a great time that day. And indeed, I was lucky enough to be in Australia in year 2000, just before the centenary of Federation. So yeah. So this is not really relevant to the story. This political situation doesn't appear in the story really, but it's interesting that it was set at that time. It was set at that time period. So basically, it's the end of the colonial era in Australia, and there's several characters who are distinctly English, and they're obviously something to do with there's a character who's Irish as well, but there's you get the feeling that these English people have kind of authority there, which they then lose once Federation happens. So my advice to you actually is to watch the 1998 cut without the scene at the end. It begins with again you get this wonderful score, the organ and the panpipes. It's just a beautiful piece actually. And it begins. There is going to be spoilers here. I'm going to take a deep dive into this particular film. It begins with the scene of these young girls. The girls, I'd say, are about 14 years old. They're sort of mid-teens, and they're at this elite boarding school in Victoria called Mrs. Not Mrs. Appleford. What's it called? What's her name? I've forgotten her bloody name now. Mrs. Appleyard. Yeah, Appleyard's College it's called. I think it was founded by her father, and she's got a photo of her father on the wall. This lady, this very rather unpleasant. I thought she was quite an unpleasant character actually, Mrs. Appleyard. I'd have hated to have a teacher like her. And this is like many of these. It's a posh school for elite girls. Although there are others who come in, like there's an orphan called Sarah. Now she's obviously being sponsored by some. She comes from an orphanage, and she's been sponsored by some kind philanthropist who's obviously got a lot of money, because this is clearly a school which is for posh girls, you know. And she's the only one actually who speaks with a very broad, a reasonably broad Australian accent. I'll say a little bit more about accents later, because this comes, there's class differences are maybe a theme in this particular film, and all the other girls speak with posh Australian accents, stroke English accents, which are pretty much the same. Now Sarah, this girl Sarah, you can see has a very deep connection with her roommate, and a slightly older girl called Miranda, and they send each other love letters and cards and things like that. And I suppose there's more than an obvious hint of a sexual element to this relationship. And at one point Miranda actually says to Sarah. Sarah in the very opening scene when they're just all getting up and they're all waking up, and there's something kind of like angelic or sort of nymph-like about the girls. All the scenes with the young girls, they sort of like they have a kind of almost elf-like. There's something almost elf-like about them. They're portrayed rather like the elves in Tolkien. They move slowly and gracefully. They wear white dresses. They smile in sort of etheric ways. It's funny that, yeah. No, it's an interesting thing. Miranda says, "Sarah, you must learn to love others," and it's sad. I mean, this is never really explored in the film, but if there was a sexual element to the relationship, there's no way they could speak out about it in 1900. You couldn't do that. But they're surrounded by women. I mean, all the girls, all the pupils are female, all the teachers are female. The only men at the college are like the old gardener, and there's a younger gardener as well. He's knocking off the maid. They don't have much they don't have much contact with. They don't really have much contact with men at all. I mean, the young gardener is like I say, he's in a relationship with the maid who serves them breakfast and serves them, does all the cleaning and things like that at this posh school. I should point out, I'm actually opposed to single-sex education from maybe secondary education onwards, because you see, it's almost like a kind of joke about homosexuality within these sort of institutions, which in boys' schools can take on a very violent element. In say Eton and Harrow, which are these boys' schools, where you get boys who have contact with no women and no girls, who are brought up completely by men and have no contact with women or girls. I don't think that's a healthy way for a teenager to live. Now, I'm saying this about both girls and boys, not just, a lot of feminists will be opposed to boys-only education, but in favour of girls-only education. It's a typical double standard of the feminists. Yeah. Feminists just seem to do this again and again. They take these identical ethical equations and they make out that one is good and the other is bad, and they have to be called out when they do that. I don't think there's anything wrong with boys being educated by men. And positive male role models, I think, are very, very good. But if they are kept completely without any contact with girls at all, I think it can affect their development psychologically. Now, when it comes to homosexuality I think is inevitable. It can be found in all social species. Or I think don't quote me on that, but I think it can be found in a lot of social species, animal species. It could be that it's an evolutionary advantage when it comes to when animals come together and live in a large community. If there's maybe 5 to 10% of the population that are only sexually attracted to their own gender, then maybe that gives the entire community some kind of advantage. so a lot of people say, you get a lot even in dissident circles. People say it's unnatural. It needs to be stamped out. It's purely a product of cultural Marxism. It has no place in a healthy society. Unfortunately, it's an inevitable part of any society. What I don't like is, obviously, this is not a subject for this film, this particular video, but it is sort of politicized very much in our society right now. And therefore, I think it may develop in among people who wouldn't naturally experience it, especially those who are on the sliding scale of bisexuality, for example, which some people theorize cover 40% of the population. Now, when you put young people in their teenage years together and don't deny them access to the opposite sex, I think that's another situation in which unnatural sexual development occurs. And that applies to the girls in this film. Now, Sarah, as I said, she's more common than the other girls at school. She speaks with a standard Australian accent, and she's been told by the end of the film that she's going to be thrown out because her sponsor is no longer paying her school fees. And she mentions that she has a brother called Bertie from whom she is separated. Interesting little subplot comes from that. But she and Miranda are essentially in love. It's all the the girls, they wear this uniform, which is, and in fact, maybe it's just normal for the time. Everyone was so much more. People in those days were so much better dressed, don't you think? If you look at old photographs, indeed the costumes in this film. None of the posh people go out without a shirt and tie. Like Michael, one of this posh English boy. He doesn't. He goes everywhere he goes. He has this shirt and tie. And this is in February, which is the middle of the Australian summer. And I mean, I've been in there during the Australian spring, and it's a sort of late summer in Australia. So in monthly terms, it's the equivalent of August, and it must be boiling. It must be absolutely boiling. So Australia is generally a much hotter country than Britain. Most of it is actually desert. But the girls are made to wear this, what looks like a very uncomfortable uniform, which includes gloves. In fact, they're quite happy when the teacher says, when they go out on this day trip, this picnic, and they're on this large cart. I mean, there's horses. There are no motor vehicles in this film because this is a rural community. Now, cars and buses and lorries were present in 1900, but they were much less common than they are today, obviously. But in cities, even in cities, it was still at that time there was still a lot of horse transport, which was together with motor vehicles. And in the rural areas, there were no motor vehicles by 1900, and so they were on this large cart. I mean, there's about a dozen of these girls go on this picnic, and they on this large horse-drawn vehicle with seats, like a little minibus with a horse-drawn minibus, I suppose. And they're told that once they go past a certain village or for a certain town, they're allowed to take their gloves off. But before that, they have to wear their gloves. They wear these bonnets, thick white dresses, stockings, black stockings. And the teachers all wear. The teacher who goes with them, Mrs. McCraw, has a very, very thick jacket on. She has like a lady pants or a dress rather, not lady pants. Women didn't wear lady pants. She has a long skirt. She has a long skirt, ankle-length skirt. She has a jacket and a cravat, and again a hat. She's played by Vivian Grey, incidentally, Miss McCraw, who is you'll recognise if she's very well known today because she played Mrs. Mangle in Neighbours for many, many years. And you can see her slightly younger, still quite old, but slightly younger in this film. It was in the 80s that I think Neighbours first appeared. And everything's very regimented at this school. They get up at a certain time, they wash, they dress, they go for breakfast, they have to have their uniform correct. There's this teacher called Mrs. Lumley who's a little bit disorganised, and she's actually banned from going on this picnic, as is Sarah, which something which eventually may well have saved their lives. But so the girls go to this picnic, and Miss Appleyard, the headmistress, who I said is a very authoritarian, very conventional person. You can see she runs this school, which has been around for a long time. It's a very old school, which was founded by her father or grandfather, and there's photos on her wall. She feels a lot of loyalty to this school, and despite her brusque manner, she does, I think, care for her school and care for her pupils in her own way. Although, as I said, I'd have hated to have a teacher like her. I really would have. I did have teachers not quite as bad as her, but I mean, I personally hated school. I just loathed it. I couldn't get away from it. So Mrs. Appleyard gives them permission to go on this picnic because it's a Saturday the 14th of February, which is, as I said, is not where Valentine's Day was actually Wednesday in 1900. But as I said, this is fiction, despite the fact it's presented as in documentary format. Indeed, the film is presented as in the same way. It's faithful to the book in that respect. There's an opening scene. There's some opening text which says, in 1900, a number of workgirls went for this picnic at Hanging Rock, and some of them never came back. So Sarah stays behind with Miss Lumley and everyone else, and of course Mrs. Appleyard, who, apart from the deleted scene, is never seen outside the school. Now, one of the teachers that goes with the girls is called Mademoiselle de Poitiers, a French woman. And despite the fact she's supposed to be a teacher, she wears a pupil's uniform. Yeah. And so they go off in this in this big coach, this big vehicle, horse-drawn vehicle. They what's his name? What's the name of the Mr. Hussey? The Mr. Hussey. I better open the. Page, the Wikipedia page, in case I need to update my notes. Remind me if anyone. Mr. Hussey is the coach driver who's like he's a typical Aussie, and he dresses less. He's working class. He dresses more casually than the others do. I think dressing up in posh clothes with jackets and ties, even in very hot weather, was a sign of social status in those days, which I suppose they just got used to it, didn't they? Now, Mr. Hussey, incidentally, there's different kinds of Australian accents, and in Australia, your accent is very much comes from your social status. In Australia, despite the fact Australia is such a huge country, geographically, it's quite surprising to find out there are no regional variations. There's no Sydney accent or Queensland accent or Perth or accent or Northern Territories accent. They all speak the same accent. However, not all Australians speak with the same accent, but they speak. People in different geographical areas will speak generally with the same series of accents. There are three main accents in Australian English: standard, posh, and strine. Now, your standard Australian accent is the one you're just familiar with, the one which probably 80% of Australians speak. It's your just normal it's your normal Aussie mate, that kind of accent. But there's posh Australian as well, which is many of the characters speaking with a posh Australian accent in this film. Posh Australian really is kind of like it's actually not that much different from the posh English accent. And even in today's world, there are Australians who still speak with a posh Australian accent and don't actually. They encourage their children not to use standard Australian. It's a sign of being very, very upper class or middle class if you speak with a posh Australian accent. There's a good documentary actually called The Story of English, which discusses the linguistics of English across the world, and they talk about different Australian accents. Now, there's another. As I said, there's no regional variations, but there are variations across social class and status. And the third accent is strine, strine simply is Australian as it's spoken by someone speaking strine. Now, strine is a very broad version of standard Australian, but it's very broad. It's much broader. And I'm not going to try to imitate someone speaking it, but a standard strine phrase would be "stry a cunt." I mean, you may have seen that, even "stry a cunt." It's almost like people put it on flags and think "stry a cunt." Stry, I mean Australia, and of course the swear word. Another thing about a strine is, if you're going to speak strine, you have to insert at least 2 swear words into every sentence. And funny things like I found actually when I was in Australia, I found that Australians tend to be much more foul-mouthed than people in Britain. But strine speakers are especially they turn the air blue especially much. And you know what? Strino is associated with the rough working class, and to speak it, if you speak in strine to someone, they're going to assume you're a dustman or a street sweeper or something, or homeless, or you're a beggar or something like that. It's kind of associated with the lumpen proletariat and the rough working class. Now, if you want to hear lots of strine spoken, watch Prisoner Cell Block H, because a lot of the characters actually come from that social background, because it's set in a women's prison. A lot of them come from that social background, so they speak strine. You don't get the swearing in Prisoner, which is, of course, because in the 70s you couldn't put swear words. Even in Australia, you couldn't put swearing into TV. But they say things like "rack off," where they, of course, mean "fuck off," and they'll say things "you mongrel" or something, where they probably mean something ruder. So you see this is very much a part of this film, I think. It's interesting listening to the different styles of speech. Now they go to Hanging Rock, which is, and it's, as I said in the introduction, it's very, very The atmosphere is created very well with sound effects, music, camera angles, things like that. It's really artistically done, and the way when even when they're going towards Hanging Rock and you see it in the distance, this huge geological feature, and there's camera angles on it. You hear this sort of noise in the background, and even some of the noise of normal things is like exaggerated. It's almost like an Oz factor kind of thing. It's almost like which people report when something strange is about to happen, including people who may well have survived these kind of disappearance-like things. So there's silences and strange. The normal bird song disappears. Firstly, it's very much exaggerated in one shot. You see birds like cawing. The Australian birds making Aussie bird noises, because bird song's different in Australia here. And then suddenly, next moment, there's utter silence. And they get to the Hanging Rock. Hanging Rock is it's kind of like a park, and it has a gate. And one of the girls gets out the coach to open the gate, and it's like secured with a wire. There's no lock on it or anything. And they open it, and the horses rear up, and you can see birds flying away. And you can just get the sense that something weird is going on, something unusual, sinister is happening. It was about to happen. It's you get the sense of it is a sense of impending doom. Funny enough, Miss McCraw, the geology teacher, Mrs. Mangle's actress, Vivian Gray, she starts. You get the sense something's not quite right about her, because she's different to the other teachers. She seems to be very withdrawn and very pensive. They're driving up with the horses. You can hear the horses in the background, and the Mr. Hussey, the driver, just says, "It's about 1,000 years old, that rock, I think." And she says, "It's 1,000,000 years old. It's 1,000,000 years old, Mr. Hussey. Much older than 1,000." He says, "1,000 million. What's the difference?" And she goes, "Oh, it's actually quite new geologically. Hanging Rock is actually it is about 1,000,000 years old. So that actually makes it newer than the surrounding rock formations, which are about 30 million years old. It actually is the remains," and she describes it in detail, which indicates she knows a lot about geology. It's basically a volcano, the remains of an old volcano from 1,000,000 years ago, and it's weathered. It's the erosion patterns which give it its strange shapes, which I described in the introduction. Some of the features look top heavy, which is why it's called Hanging Rock. It's this like chaotic. It's this chaotic scenery and things like that. It's odd, that it's so different from where they've come from. They've come from this posh school. Everything's clean. Everything's all straight lines. And they're all dressed in perfect, neat uniform. And they go to this place where everything's natural, everything's raw, everything's chaotic. And it's a kind of like a real juxtaposition, a real contradiction. It's a 180-degree flip from where they were originally, and they go to this picnic at this place, this 1,000,000-year-old lump of twisted, warped rock with strange shapes everywhere, and you hear this, along with the spooky music. You hear like this moaning and rumbling noise in the background when they're there, and you think it might be wind blowing through the rock, making weird noises. And when they arrive at the rock, there's somebody nearby, and you introduce your new character, Michael, this posh young English guy, and his parents. And he's this very prim and proper English boy, like I said, with a perfectly suit. He has like a little trilby hat, was a boater or something on his head, and he has like a suit and everything. And his friend is actually his best friend is one of the servants in the household. He's called Albert, who's this working class Aussie, who's they're an odd kind of pair, the two of them, actually, because he's obviously very fond of Michael, and it's vice versa. But he's so different. He gulps wine from a bottle and thinks, or beer, or so he drinks the bottle. He says, "Have some of this then, Michael. Have some of that." And Michael goes, and he sort of wipes the top, and he goes, he doesn't know what to do. He wants to pour it into a glass. Yeah. And there's several scenes in the school while this is going on, and Sarah's writing her own poetry, you see, and Mrs. Appleyard tries to get her to read poetry. And Sarah doesn't want to. Sarah's writing her own poetry. She tries to read it out, and Mrs. Appleyard stops her. It's like, I said, old cow. I think, despite the fact, my school was an absolute shithole and I hated it, I couldn't wait to get away from it. I don't think my teachers, if I was writing my own poetry, I don't believe my teachers would have put me off. I really don't think they would have done. So they're at the picnic, they're all sitting around there and they're entertaining themselves by doing needlework. They're eating cake and things like that and food, and they're reading or doing needlework. Miss Craw is reading a book on sort of geometry and things like that. She's obviously a scientific type of person. Mrs. Appleyard later describes her as masculine, although I didn't get that impression. She's sort of like just a school marmish type person. And then one of them, Miss McCraw asks, "What's the time, Mr. Hussey?" Mr. Hussey looks at his watch and says, "Oh, my watch has stopped. My watch stopped at midday." And she looks at her own watch, and everyone has like these pocket watches. There were no wrist watches those days. And everybody's watch has stopped at midday, and that's another hint that something is not quite right. And Mr. Hussey Blimey looks at the sun and he says it must be 2 p.m. or something like that. I mean, people who live in rural areas are actually quite good at that. They're quite good at subconsciously just knowing what time of day it is just by seeing where the sun is in the sky. There's that amusing scene in Crocodile Dundee where the eponymous Mick Dundee, he looks at the sun for a minute and squints and says, "Oh, it's 10 past 3 or something like that." And maybe that's a slight exaggeration of what it's actually like for these people in their real life. And so at that point, I think if I'd been there, I'd have a lot with all the other I'd have sensed weird things going on by then, the weird noises and the things like that, and the behaviour of the animals. I'd have realised something strange was happening, and I'd have probably because I know a lot about the kind of phenomena which takes place, which I said is a real thing. But they seem to be pretty oblivious. And now Mrs. Appleyard has told them not to go and try and climb the rock because it's dangerous. Not in the way that it turns out to be dangerous, but she thinks you can easily fall and hurt yourself. There's sometimes undesirable people hanging around, things like that. But for all the girls, Miranda, Marion, Irma, and Edith, these 4 girls from the class, they ask Mademoiselle de Poitiers. They say, "Mademoiselle, can we go and explore the rock?" And she gives them permission against Mrs. Appleyard's instructions, and so they wander off to explore the rock. And Michael and Albert are watching the girls as they sort of walk along, and they're admiring them. And Michael's being a typical Aussie bloke. He's saying, "Oh yeah, it's built like an hourglass, that one. She got legs that go right up to her bum," and things like that. And Michael is going, "Oh, Albert, I don't think you should talk like that." But he spots Miranda, and he's transfixed. And he's obviously quite he's sort of and she's sort of again they're portrayed in this graceful elfine manner. In fact, even Mademoiselle de Poitiers, actually, she is looking at a picture of the famous picture of Botticelli's Venus, where the Venus is rising out of a seashell. You may have seen that, and she thinks that Miranda looks like that figure in that painting. So the girls cross over a creek, a little stream, and Michael's saying, "Oh, I think that..." Michael is sort of Albert is laughing, hoping they fall in and get wet. He's laughing at them and just saying, "Oh, is that one's foot's gone in the mud," and things like that. And Michael is transfixed on Miranda. He's just seen her from a distance, but it's kind of love at first sight kind of thing. Love at first sight is a real thing, actually, believe it or not. I mean, it's sort of ridiculed, and I suppose it is a bit silly in a way. But you see, it's happened to me. It has happened to me. I won't give any details, but it has happened to me. Now, one of the girls, Edith, is more cautious because she's sort of shorter, rather slightly overweight girl with glasses, sort of like the school SWAT type person. Oddly enough, she's one of the characters who has a voiceover, and you can tell because some of her dialogue doesn't match her lips, as if the dubbing hasn't been done very well, or the recording hasn't been accurate. It's the lip sync is out, and in fact you can almost see that Weir is trying to shoot her. In most of the scenes where she's speaking, actually, she has her head turned slightly away, as if she actually did some full frontal shots, dialogue shots, and he decided that the lip sync was so far out he couldn't use them. But as the girls start climbing this lump of rock. It's not very big. It's not like a mountain. I think it said it was like 400 feet high or something. How high is Hanging Rock? Yeah, it's oh, it says 6.25 million years old, so it's not quite. It's actually slightly a lot older than Miss McCraw was saying, but it's 708 meters. It's 105 meters above the plane. Right, it's about 300 feet high. I'll just show you like some of the. Well, I showed you before some of it, but this is like. There you go. That sort of lintel there, this sort of like where you go on through this little natural bridge. That appears in the film quite a lot. You actually see them going through this space here. Although this footpath wasn't there and this handrail wasn't there when the film was made. But yeah. But they climb up this. They start climbing. There's lots of like a lot of the erosion channels from rain and things have left spaces where you can walk down little narrow valleys, and it's what geologists call chaotic terrain. And they explore the nooks and crannies of this rock. And they seem to their behaviour changes. They start to move a bit more naturally, and they start removing some of their surplus clothing. As they climb higher, it's almost like it's a weird kind of. I would describe it as a kind of baptism. Maybe that's what it's. They seem to be entering. It's almost, you can already sense they're entering a different kind of realm. They start speaking more freely. They've already taken off their gloves. They take their shoes and stockings off, and they start walking in bare feet. Things like that. They get into a lot of trouble for if Mrs. Appleyard caught them. As they start climbing higher and higher. One point, Miranda says, we can't go any much further without unless we can't go much further because we told Mademoiselle de Poitiers we'd come back. But it seems like she's kind of half-hearted in what she's saying. You already sense that something is affecting their minds. At one point, Marion, this taller girl with glasses, she looks down on the rest of the picnic and she says, they look totally different. She says something. What was the word she said? I can't remember. But the music is playing in the background, and it's very, very. You can see them. They're all like sleeping. They're all sort of like they're all sleeping down in the picnic site on the ground. And they reach the spot, and then suddenly they all lie down to sleep as well. I don't know if that's a normal siesta or something, but back where they're all having a picnic, the others go to sleep as well. I don't know, but Miss McCraw doesn't. Miss McCraw doesn't. But you already sense that is it normal to go to sleep at this point? I mean, at that point, I wasn't sure at that point whether anything strange was going on. Although I'd already had the impression that some kind of supernatural force had come to life and was at work in the air. And then suddenly, I think the most frightening part of the film occurs. Now, what happens is, Edith is more cautious. She hasn't taken off her shoes and stockings. She's remained fully dressed. She keeps saying, "Oh, I don't want to go any further. I feel ill." And she sits down when the others are walking ahead, and she reluctantly follows them. I get the feeling that Edith is not under the same spell. She's not affected by the same power that the other girls are, and also, I think she senses danger. All through the climb, she senses danger. But this comes to a head because at that point, Edith, who's not asleep, she becomes very frightened because Miranda, Marion, and Irma they very slowly, without saying a word, they wake up. They stand up and then they walk off down a little pathway. They just walk off in single file, without saying a single word or looking at each other or looking at Edith. And they walk off down a pathway, and Edith shouts at them as they walk away, "Come back, come back!" And she knows something very seriously has gone wrong. I mean, she wouldn't normally be that frightened. She's screaming at them with fear, and I just go up and say, "What are you doing? Come back!" And I go up and I sort of like tap their shoulder or something. Edith just screams at them, "Don't come back, come back!" The girls ignore her and they just walk away into this. They walk and again, their movements are sort of like flowing as if they're Alpine again, but in a different way. And you know that something very, very unusual is happening. Edith then runs off screaming, in panic. The next scene, the carriage returns late. Mrs. Appleyard is like very worried. She's looking at the clock, and it's like 10:30 at night, and she finds out what happens. And what happens is she also not only have those 3 girls gone missing, those 3 girls were then lost after they walked off down the pathway. No one could find them, and they did try. The teachers did try to find them and couldn't. But Miss McCraw was also missing, and I didn't. That was a surprise because I didn't realise exactly how it was that because she was just sitting at the campsite reading a book. She wasn't asleep. They call the police, and the next day, and they can't do much at night, but the police go. In those days, you didn't have much in the way of artificial light. The police go back with helpers, and lots of the local people are coming out, and they search the entire area. Now, all through, even though the viewer, I think all kinds of possibilities are left open. There's nothing explicit in this film which explains exactly what happens. But to me, I think the viewers, I don't think there's any doubt, having rewatched this film, there's no doubt at all that the viewer is being informed that some kind of malevolent supernatural force is the cause of this. But the local people, most of the people, including the staff, don't really understand that, and they believe that basically these girls have been kidnapped by some thugs. Mrs. Appleyard goes up to the doctor, and when the doctor explains, when Edith is like the sole survivor from the group, and she's like bruised and battered from running in a panic. She ran through thorns and things. And Mrs. Appleyard implicitly asked the doctor, basically, is she all right? And he says, yes, bruised. But the doctor says she's got bruises here and cuts here. And Mrs. Appleyard said, anything else? She's implicitly asking the doctor if Edith was raped. And he says no. And they do this several times, actually. The word they use is she intact? And I think in those days it was like that. They wanted to know. I think if it had turned out that she had actually been raped, it would have kind of like lowered her social status. But the doctor says no. I wouldn't like to know how he found that out. But no. But Edith said. Funnily enough, Edith gives us a clue about what happened to Miss McCraw, and being a bit embarrassed because of the society she lives in, which I think is quite well reproduced. The kind of the prudishness of the society, which it was back then, is quite well reproduced. She says she passed Miss McCraw. She was running down the rock in panic. She passed Miss McCraw going up onto the rock, and she'd stripped down to her underwear. And she said she saw a red cloud. That's literally the only clue we have of what happened. Now Sarah is devastated. You know something's going to happen because when they all head off for the rock, Sarah is standing on the balcony of the top balcony of the building, waving, and Miranda sort of waves back to her, and it's almost like a farewell. But of course, Sarah loves Miranda, and she's very sad. Like there's a scene where the policeman has to come in and take some underwear from Miranda's cupboard. And this is just for the sniffer dogs, because they've got sniffer dogs out trying to find the girls. And he's sort of very apologetic as he takes some of her bloomers from the drawer. They also drag in. There's a little pond nearby, and there's people. They're using like grappling hooks to drag the water. They're basically throwing them into the water and pulling them to see if there's any solid objects on the bottom of the water they can pull out. In other words, bodies from people who've drowned. There's all kinds of theories about what might have happened to them, and most of the people in the community actually don't really suspect there's anything really mysterious until later. But Michael is actually a prime suspect at the time, and he feels an enormous amount of compassion for the girls, and he wants to go and find them. He becomes a bit obsessed with this whole thing, and probably because he saw Miranda from a distance and was sort of like smitten. And Albert tries to persuade him to talk him out of it in his typical working class Aussie way. He says he's very pragmatic. Like, they're going to be dead by now, mate. It's like a week has gone past. But when Michael's talking to Albert about it, and Michael says, "All right, I'll go alone then. I shall go alone." And he leaves in the early morning to go alone. But then he sees Albert waiting for him, and Albert agrees to accompany him. And when Michael chooses to stay overnight at the Rock, and Albert agrees to cover for him by pretending he got drunk at a pub or something. There's a lot of talk about how there's a lot of discussion in a sense about how such a thing would affect the community, these disappearances, and it's got a lot to do with distrust, because, as I said, the people, the main theory is that firstly they think the girls might have got lost and they just died of dehydration and heat exhaustion, which is the most likely thing that happened. And they're basically going on. They're combing the entire area. The police, volunteers, they've got sniffer dogs. They're dragging the water with grappling hooks. They expect to find dead bodies of these girls that eventually they just got lost and eventually died of exposure. When that doesn't happen, they start to suspect kidnapping. And the policeman's wife is like muttering about gossip and things like that. Michael, though, you get the feeling at first that Michael might be. You get the spooky music and the sound effects when Michael goes up onto the Rock, and you think he's going to be swallowed up by the same phenomenon. And he's going around calling Miranda's name, and luckily he leaves a paper trail. By that I mean he has a little notebook of a notepad, and he keeps pulling pages out and sticking them on branches and twigs, because so people could find him. And it's lucky he does, actually, because after spending all night on the Rock, he himself becomes dehydrated and exhausted, and he has to be basically taken away by a horse-drawn ambulance, and Albert comes back and has to rescue him. And as he's lifted into the ambulance, he hands Albert a scrap of cloth from one of the girl's dresses. And he does find the remains of a piece of cloth, but something. The vultures start circling, and you find the music becomes very sort of upbeat and exciting. Albert goes up onto the Rock, and you know something's going to happen. And believe it or not, he finds one of the girls. He finds Irma, one of the girls. She's unconscious, she's injured, she's got cuts and bruises, but the doctor actually says later on, it's weird, she's got, her feet are alright, but her hands are cut, her nails are worn down, and she finds them, but he finds this is, I'll come on to this later, because this actually happens with real events at this time, because like I said, this sort of thing happens in real life. He finds her just curled up on the side of one of the pathways on the Rock, which of course have already been searched. Over the last week, everyone's been all over that Rock with sniffer dogs and with hundreds of people. And Albert goes up and finds her lying there unconscious. And she's taken to Michael's home, actually, Michael's family home, and treated for dehydration and exhaustion. And the doctor's surprised. She had a week out in the bush, and the doctor's surprised she's not in a worse condition. So where has she been? The maid says, "Oh, she's got no corset on," but I think they took their corsets off, so she's just wearing a simple dress. And the whole town comes out when the word has got round, and the whole town comes out, and they're sort of lining the streets, watching as this ambulance takes the girl Irma through, and you can hear them shouting, "We want something done about it. We've got our self-respect to think about." And things like that. "What happened? We got a bloody right to know," one of them shouts. Again, I think they assumed the girls were just abducted by thugs. In fact, one of the young gardener, he's got an Irish accent. It's ironic, actually, because he's complaining about immigration to Australia, and there was a lot of immigration to Australia at that time. Including members of my family actually went there around that time, which, as I talked about in my Wales video I did in Wales. But the gardener says, "Oh, it's the Polish. They must have the Polish did it." In other words, the Polish did it. He's this Irish guy who's obviously a recent immigrant himself from Ireland, and he's suspicious of the Polish immigrants. It's almost like Gangs of New York. and he suspects that there's a Polish serial killer or human traffickers or something, and but then he says something very strange. He says he saw a light. He says, I saw a light above a pigsty. And that's where and again, along with Edith seeing the red cloud, that's the first you hear about something supernatural going on. It sounds like today we'd call that a UFO sighting, or a luminosity, an orb. And he's lying in bed with the maid, who's his girlfriend, and he's sort of singing this. She's sort of like they're sort of like having pillow talk, and he starts singing a song, and one of the lyrics is "Death is in the skies." I've never heard this song before, but it may have been composed for the film. But death is in the skies. It's very strange. Irma can't remember anything about what happened. She has no memory of what happened during her disappearance. In real life disappearances of this kind, occasionally when people come back, like Konstantinos Philippidis, who I've talked about him before on Hapanmo Voice. This Konstantinos Philippidis, I'll give a bit of background because I know none of you read Hapanmo Voice, or very few of you. He's a guy from Toronto, Canada, who's a keen skier. Now he went skiing with his friends at White Mountain, New York State, USA, which is actually a former Olympic skiing area, and he vanished, and it was one of these mysterious disappearances, just like the one portrayed in the film. It doesn't look like he left his car behind in the car park, things like that. He left all his belongings, his money and everything and his passport in the hotel safe, and again, it's strange things happened. I mean, there's a massive search and rescue. The mountain rescue people come in, and oddly enough, this also often happens during these disappearances, these mysterious disappearances. I'm going to talk more about in a minute. These real life disappearances. The mountain rescue, the local mountain rescue service, was assisted by the Department of Homeland Security. It's usually either them or the FBI. Very strange thing. Anyway, Konstantinos, he appeared a week later in California. And he was just found wandering the streets. He was still wearing his skiing helmet and all his skiing gear. He didn't have skis with him, but everything else was there. And he has no memory of what happened during his disappearance. He was lucky enough that he was returned by whatever force made him disappear. Irma, again, was returned. Again, it's a common recurring theme. She was found by Albert in an area of the rock which had already been searched multiple times, and then she just suddenly comes back there. Michael is pleased that Irma's all right, but Michael is very, very self-possessed. He's very sort of like turning in on himself at that point, because he wants Miranda to be found. Even though he's searching for all the girls, he wants to find Miranda, this girl he was really he's seen from a distance and has sort of fallen head over heels for. What you see is odd is you see a white swan in many of the scenes wherever Michael is talking about Miranda, or obviously thinking about Miranda, you see a white swan. Even for some reason he's lying in bed and there's this white swan beside him in the bed, which of course you wouldn't invite a swan to come and sit in your bed unless you're that kinky. Which is odd. I mean, you see, native Australian swans are black. It's really weird, actually, if you've ever been to Australia. There's swans that look just like the swans in Britain, but they're black instead of white. So it's almost like the swan is a placeholder for Miranda within Michael's psyche. Now, Mrs. Appleyard is this is the worst side of her. She shows her worst side. It's pretty clear she has this conversation with Miss Lumley, and it's pretty obvious her main concern about this is the school's reputation. It's damaging the school's reputation. The community are turning against the school. A lot of parents are withdrawing their children from the school now as a result of this. Because Miss Lumley says, "Isn't it wonderful Irma's been found alive?" And Mrs. Appleyard says, "Don't be silly. This isn't good. This is worse." I mean, she's a heartless bitch. She really is. And that's that. Mrs. Appleyard has a breakdown, but only as a result of Only as a result, like I said, all she cares about is the schools. She doesn't care about the welfare of the girls. Now there's a renewed search for the girls following the Irma turning up. There's the search parties go back to look for the other girls, thinking, hang on, if one girl turns up, maybe the others will. I don't know if any of them suspect that something's happening. Something strange is going on. Surely at that point they must have realised something odd is going on, because Irma, has no memory of what happened during her disappearance, but they must think it's odd that she survived that long in the Australian bush in the middle of summer. There's no sign, there's that usual conversation, Mrs. Appleyard, was she molested? Is she intact? Is she intact? And she's not been raped. Which is what everyone suspects. Everyone suspects human traffickers or the Polish thugs have got hold of her and raped her. This is why they assume they're never going to see her again, and after time goes past, they assume she's going to be dead. Now, Sarah. In the meantime, Sarah is not eating. Sarah's very depressed because Miranda hasn't been found, and she's going to have to leave the school. But Miranda, Marion, and Miss Craw are still not. It can't be found. And then a poster is put up. A rather strange poster, actually, because it has a picture of Miranda and Marion on, and a picture of Miss Craw, and it says underneath, "Missing, presumed dead," because the second major search didn't yield any. The other girls were not returned. And there's more and more bad press going around. At one point, you see a reporter, a news reporter, rides past the school on his bike, and he kind of parks and he gets a camera out. And it was more difficult to do that in those days with the big box cameras, but he takes a sneaky photo of the girls in the grounds of the college, and the teachers drive them away. It's interesting at that point because Sarah is clearly becoming more and more depressed. She talks to Miranda's portraits and even puts flowers by it, and she has a discussion with Mademoiselle de Poitiers and says that she suspects that Miranda was psychic. It's a strange thing. She hints at it. Miranda knew things. Miranda knew in advance things like she wasn't going to come back. Miranda knew she wasn't going to come back, as if Miranda could sense what was happening. It's like, at the same time, you feel that Miranda, she willingly went up onto the rock if she knew something terrible was going to happen. She wouldn't have gone. It's a strange thing, and it's only a hint. It's not like an explicit conversation. And there's a horrible scene actually, because they go to the school gym, and Irma is leaving the school. She's going to go home. She's recovered now. She's going to go home to her family, and she's taken to the school gym to say goodbye. And it's a horrible scene because Sarah is strapped to this wooden board and she's tied up. And apparently, in those days, it's a way of, it's supposedly a cure for a bad back. And Mrs. Appleyard thinks Sarah's not sitting straight, so she has a bad posture, and so it needs to be corrected. And so they strapped her to this board. I don't know if they wouldn't do that nowadays. But as Irma goes to say goodbye, the other girls attack her. They say, "Tell us what happened. Where are Miranda and Marion?" And the other girls are almost hitting her because they think she must know what happened to Miranda and Marion. Of course, Irma doesn't. And then Miss Lumley resigns. Mrs. Appleyard then starts drinking heavily. And then you find out, first there's two scenes. You find out that Albert reveals to Michael he had a dream where he met his lost sister. You find out that Albert, sees an orphan, went from an orphanage, and he said he had a lost sister who called her Bertie. Well, Sarah has a lost brother whom she calls Bertie. I mean, it's obvious then at that point that Albert is Sarah's brother. It's sad. It's very sad because the girls are then sent home early for a holiday, and then Mrs. Appleyard is cracking up, and she tells everyone that Sarah has been returned to the orphanage, but Sarah then, sadly, she jumps out of her bedroom window and lands on top of the greenhouse and dies. And I said there'd be spoilers, but there are. This is the review. It's actually it's a sad moment, actually. It really is. There's some really sad moments in This film. And in the final scene, there's in the final scene of the edited version, you just see Mrs. Appleyard sitting. They realise that Mrs. Appleyard has lied about Sarah, and she knows the school is finished. She knows the girls are going home for their holiday and they're never coming back. That school is now going to close, and she's sitting there in a black dress. It's almost like she's mourning the school. And at the end, you hear this voiceover stating, and there's like some text stating, Mrs. Appleyard was later found at Hanging Rock, dead. She was lying at the bottom. No one knew exactly why she died, but it's suspected she was trying to climb the rock. Now, in the deleted scene, there's a 7-minute deleted scene at the very end where Mrs. Appleyard does go to Hanging Rock. She walks up it, and you feel, and then she seems to go through the same experience the girls do. And at one point, she sees one of the missing girls. Almost, you don't know if it's a hallucination or something. And then the next scene, you see her being carried away on a stretcher by these guys, and then you get the same voiceover. I personally think it'd be better. It's again, I correct myself what I said earlier. It's not actually better that Mrs. Appleyard goes to the rock. The director's cut, even though it's shorter, is better because it's out of character for her to do that. Even though she's having a massive breakdown, she drinks heavily at dinner with Mademoiselle de Poitiers, who's the only remaining teacher, and she's like, she's knocking back the wine and stuff, and so you know she's having a bit of a breakdown. But this is just too out of character for her. She's actually a very cruel and, I think, heartless person. She doesn't care about the girls. It's out of character for her to go to Hanging Rock. I mean, as I said, every single scene she's at the school. Every single scene she's at the school. Any bit of trivia. It's interesting, it's strange, just a coincidence, nothing to worry about kind of things. The actual school doesn't exist. Appleyard College doesn't exist. It's fictional. But the exterior shots were filmed at this place called Martindale Hall, which is at Mintaro in South Australia. All the out exterior shots of the school were filmed there. The interior shots were filmed at the studios. They were in the studio. Now, funnily enough, Joan Lindsay, the author of the book, based Appleyard College on her own school. She actually she wasn't a boarder, but she was a day girl at this posh school called the Clyde Girls Grammar School in St Kilda, Victoria, which is just outside Melbourne, I believe. And she attended that when she was a teenager, Joan Lindsay. Now, strangely enough, this is one of these weird coincidences. After she left, this was many, many years before she wrote the book. She actually didn't start writing until she was a middle-aged woman. But many, many decades before she wrote the book, after she'd left this school, the school, and maybe she knew about this, and maybe that's what inspired her, but the school actually transferred to a place called Woodend. Now, Woodend is basically the community southwest of Hanging Rock, which is exactly where the fictional school would have been. Maybe it wasn't a coincidence. Maybe Joan Lindsay maybe that gave her the idea for the story. It could have been that's what gave her the idea for the story. As I said, though, this Australian new wave of Aussiewood, which I talked about in the introduction, there are no Aborigines in this particular film, but there is this. I think there is the theme of supernatural forces at work in the film, which possibly the indigenous population would have understood, and the white Australians, who were quite recent arrivals. I mean, Australia wasn't even discovered, wasn't landed on. I think it was Captain Cook in the 1780s. I think he was the first outsider to land there. And so, at the time this film takes place, Australia as a colony is only just over a century old. And you see, you get the sense, I think, that the white Australians back then, and indeed probably still today, they have to contend with the fact they don't have a biospirit for their location. And a biospirit is basically a connection with which indigenous populations have to the land they live in. For example, I mean, the most politically incorrect manifestation of this theory is, of course, white people having a biospirit for Britain and Europe. But it can be applied everywhere. Black people have a biospirit connection to Africa, Australian Aborigines with Australia, Chinese people with China, Middle Eastern people with the Middle East, etc., etc. When you move people away from the place where they have their natural biospirit connection to the land, they never quite fit. They never quite fit in. Even after 5 or 6 generations, they never quite fit in. They always feel out of place in some way. And they have to contend with, for example, the spiritual forces of the land, which are not only exist and not only can be dangerous, not for the indigenous people, but maybe more so for those who have recent arrivals, who originate from beyond those shores. And seen as Hanging Rock is a sacred site for the Aborigines. Joan Lindsay would have known about this. You could argue, and I think correctly, that was probably what it may well have inspired her to write this story. And as I said, the place looks very frightening. It has these strange, the way the erosion patterns of the rock, these considerable erosion patterns going back 1 million years, have given it a strange atmosphere. You can see some of the shots. You see the rock with the face. The rock I showed you in the introduction with what looks like a human face on it. You actually see in the film as well. You can well believe that anyone who visited that place would suspect, it could well be the place of spirits and things like that, and dreamtime spirits, as the Aborigines call them. Now, what's interesting about it as well is that this film, the book was written in the late 60s, the film was made in the mid 70s, but it talked about a phenomenon which actually is a real phenomenon. It's where people they just go out on their own somewhere, either as a group or on their own, and they never come back. And there's no obvious reason why they've gone. And this is something that clearly Joan Lindsay knew about, even if this wasn't a real story. I mean, she writes as a kind of docudrama, but of course it is fictional. Even though she won't actually say that out loud, it's obvious it is fictional. But the scenario you saw in that story actually happens. Even though the community around the school they're very divided over what happened. In the end, the gardener comes around to the possibility that something supernatural might have happened. He starts talking about lights above pigsties. He and the policeman's wife and the other local people, and indeed the teachers at the school and the doctor, they all have this idea that basically it's a much more simple, down-to-earth thing that happened to these girls. They were wandering on the rock, and thugs grabbed them. Rapists, human traffickers, whoever they might be, Polish thugs or whatever they might be. And of course, the only witness to what happened to the girl was Edith. I think, of course, Edith survived, because in the story you have to have some witness to describe them just walking off in this weird way, without a single word, just getting up and walking away. And Edith, of course, witnesses this, which is how we know about it, how the viewer or reader knows about it. And she actually kind of drops out of the story after her initial witness testimony. So we can assume she's been ignored by most of the people in the story. But of course, what happens in that story happens in real life. I mentioned Constantinos Philippidis. Now that's an idea of someone disappearing and then returning, which sometimes does happen. But huge numbers of people disappear without trace, and there's no obvious reason why they've gone, why they've vanished. And you've probably guessed by now. In fact, I've already seen some comments in the introduction video mentioning the missing 411, David Paulides and the missing 411, which of course there's the website Can-Am, Missing Persons, and the 2 documentaries, Missing 411 and Missing 411 The Hunted, discuss some of these very disturbing, these extremely disturbing situations where there's no real conclusion about what happens, and Paulides doesn't say explicitly what he thinks going on. His documentary is basically a process of elimination. He talks about the people who disappeared. He explains why he thinks they didn't go wrong. Why he thinks he explains what he thinks didn't happen to them. he'll say things like, "Well, the sniffer dogs went up and they came to the end of the trail. They tracked this guy to a certain point. Then it's just like they can't track him any further. It's like he's just been lifted into the air at that point." Or, well, these people they searched the area from top to bottom and they found nothing. And then over a week they searched the entire area for a week. A strand of hair. They'd have found a strand of hair. And then a month later, some people are rambling in the woods and they come across their clothes, and the clothes are folded neatly, and things like that. There's even stories of like Bobby Bishop, this young boy who, he was walking along. He was part of a church camp, and he was walking along behind this guy. He's sort of like 80% deaf, and so this leader kept turning around and talking to him like face to face with this boy's behind him. He's carrying his fishing rod and things like that. He'd been fishing and speaking to him so that Bobby could read his lips. And when he's speaking, he turns around and he carries on walking. Just literally seconds later, he turns around again and Bobby's gone. Bobby's just not there. Fishing rod, clothing, everything's gone, and his hearing aid. And his hearing aid turns up later. It's creepy. There's absolutely no doubt that, although Paul Idy doesn't say so totally, he suggests throughout these entire films that there's some supernatural forces at work which is causing these people to vanish. I mean, some of them just don't go. They just. Sometimes you get like groups of people, like these old guys who go hunting one day in this wood near this lake. One of them just disappears. He just disappears. He's gone. He's never to be seen again. This old guy, he's like 85 or something. He's not going to run anywhere. He's got one eye. I mean, he's very distinctive, and he's just gone. And the sniffer dogs can trace him up to where he was waiting with his gun, because they were like hunting as a group, hunting deer, and the dogs can't trace him any further. What's going on? It's like weird, and it is frightening. It's a frightening thing, and after watching those movies, I went out for walks in the wood and stuff, and I'd sort of like looking over my shoulder like that, thinking, what's going on? Am I going to come back, and things like that. At one point, Jan Maccabee is interviewed. Now, Jan, she's a very, very experienced outdoors woman, and you may recognise her surname because she's married to Bruce Maccabee, the ufologist. She's sort of like she's out hunting one day, and she sees this strange shape coming towards her. It's like a distortion in the air. Her description reminds me of the film Predator, with the alien with its invisibility cloak. Now that actually happened in a stretch of woods not far from her back garden. She was literally about 300 feet from her back garden, in a town. So it could happen anywhere. And what actually we see, what this film describes, is a typical Paulidian disappearance case. It really is. If it was real, you can imagine him talking about it, and even though it's happened a long time ago, you can imagine him talking about it in his series. But the book and the film were made decades before David Paulides started the Missing 411. The books and the database and the movies and things and the YouTube channel. It's like, and there are certain locations where it happens more than others. Mount Rainier, for example, in Washington, USA. Which, oddly enough, is where Kenneth Arnold saw the UFOs. But you see, he doesn't bring in UFOs or anything. There's no UFOs in this film apart from the light above the pigsty that the gardener mentions. And in the Missing 411, you don't see that as well. You don't see that either. In the case of the old guy with the one eye, they hear a strange noise, like a crackling noise in the woods, but they sort of shrug it off. It could mean anything, That's it. If you saw a flying saucer swooping down towards where he was sitting, or like a group of Bigfoots running through the undergrowth towards that area, you'd have like some kind of clue about what might happen to him. But it's just nothing. And this particular film portrays a case exactly like that. And it seems unlikely that Joan Lindsay would simply come up with this idea through her own imagination, when it so often matches what Paulides describes. I mean, it was going on. It's not something that's just emerged in the recent world. In fact, the Bobby Bishop disappearance happened in 1958, before the book was written and before the film was made, years before that. So it was, she may well have heard about real cases and decided to write a fictionalized version of that. And it happened in like a spooky location where maybe there has been a cluster of disappearances. You know, it's that kind of thing. It's worth bearing that in mind, actually. I was joking in the introduction when I said if you dare, but if you do visit the location and decide to have a wander along the little footpath there, because they seem to have installed a proper footpath now. There's actually some pictures and YouTube videos of people, fans of the movie, going there, and some of them were even wearing costumes from the film, and like taking shots which reproduce the shots in the film. Just be careful. Don't go alone. Keep your mobile phone switched on, you know, and keep in touch with people. It's because this, whatever force it is that makes people disappear, whatever happens to them when they've disappeared, God knows, I dread to think. Because sometimes kids disappear, like these girls, you know, and even like little toddlers disappear. Horrible thing, horrible idea. But seriously, you know, be careful. It's just worth bearing in mind that whatever force this is, it seems to pick on individuals who can be like snatched away without anyone noticing, and like people wandering in the countryside on their own or in small groups, that sort of thing. So that was my review of Picnic at Hanging Rock, a film I think is very good, and yeah, I do hope to. I'll do the live stream at some point in the future after I get back. I'm only going to be away for 5 days, but it feels like it's a massive, massive chunk out of my Panmo TV sort of like schedule. But I will do a live stream on this. I may well have to do a comment reply before I do the live stream, but I hope you've enjoyed this review section a little bit earlier than I normally do it. But there you go. And if you've watched the film, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I'll be back soon with another video. Hospital Port as pride and dignity. Stop the New World Order.